on the corner of Franklin and 8th, the wind cut like a blade. It was the kind of morning that slapped your face just for stepping outside, the kind that reminded the working poor that winter in New York doesn't wait for payday. Jake Miller had barely gotten the shop lights on when he saw her, a hunched figure pedaling a rust-bitten bike through black ice and exhaust fog. She wasn't just struggling. She was losing. One wheel caught on a sidewalk crack, and down she went. No dramatics, no cries for help. Just a quiet fall, the kind life reserves for people who've stopped expecting anyone to notice. Jake didn't hesitate. He dropped the oil pan, wiped his hands on his jeans, and bolted out of the garage. She was curled against the curb, her coat threadbare, her hands scraped raw, her breath short and clouding the air like a leaky radiator. Gray hair stuck out beneath a knit cap, and her eyes darted between pain and embarrassment. She whispered, "I just needed to get to the pharmacy. My legs aren't what they used to be." Jake steadied her gently, already inspecting the busted chain. "You shouldn't be riding alone in this cold," he said. "Come on inside. We've got heat, and coffee that's legally drinkable." He walked her into the service bay, sat her down near the office heater, poured the weakest cup of coffee known to man from the employee pot, and got to work. The bike wasn't just old, it was practically held together by rust and prayer, but Jake fixed it, carefully, quietly, like it mattered. That's when it came. A voice so loud and bitter it could scratch glass. "Miller." Ron Dorsey stomped in from the back, red-faced, puffing like a furnace, toothpick clenched like it owed him rent. "What do you think you're doing?" Jake didn't answer immediately. He wiped grease from his fingers and straightened. She fell outside. Her bike broke, just trying to get to the pharmacy. "I'm not running a rescue shelter," Ron barked. He jabbed a thumb toward the exit. "She's not a customer. You see any invoice in her hand? You want to be a hero? Do it on your own damn time. This is a business, not a halfway house." Jake didn't flinch. "The chain's fixed. She'll be gone in 60 seconds. "Not fast enough," Ron snapped. "You're fired." The air in the garage froze harder than the streets outside. Jake blinked. For a second, he thought he misheard. But Ron was already pointing at the break room with the authority of a man who'd done this before, and enjoyed it. "Grab your crap and go." Jake stood there, jaw tight, eyes still on the woman cradling the coffee with both hands like it was the last warmth she'd ever get. She looked like she wanted to say something. He shook his head gently. "You're good," he murmured. "Don't worry about it." No one else spoke. Not the guy tightening bolts on a Dodge in Bay 2. Not the cashier scrolling Instagram behind the plexiglass. Not one word from the crew he'd pulled double shifts with for months. Jake walked out with his jacket half-zipped and his pride fully intact. He didn't ask for his last paycheck. He didn't even ask for an explanation. He knew exactly what had just happened. In a room full of tools, the cheapest one had spoken the loudest. And for what? A few minutes of decency, a warm cup of coffee, a moment of choosing humanity over policy. At the end of the day, she was just a stranger on a broken bike, and he was just a mechanic with bad boots, a rent check he couldn't cover, and a mother who needed medicine by Friday. But somehow, that had been too much kindness for a Monday morning. Jake didn't regret it, not for a second. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this woman wasn't just poor or old or unlucky. She was watching, testing, measuring, and Jake Miller had just passed a test no one else had even noticed was happening. The rest of Brookhaven would find out soon enough. The sun hadn't fully bothered to wake up when Brookhaven's peace was shattered. Not by gunfire, not by sirens, but by 7 engines purring like well-fed panthers. They didn't rev, they didn't honk, they simply arrived. One by one, identical, ominous, black SUVs with windows so dark you couldn't tell if they were carrying federal agents or extraterrestrials. Jake Miller, fresh out of sleep and still in his threadbare robe, squinted into the light. For a moment, he genuinely considered that he'd left the stove on and somehow summoned Homeland Security. It wouldn't be the weirdest thing that happened this week. A curtain twitched across the street, then another. Then a dog barked, the universal American alarm clock for impending drama. Jake rubbed the heel of his hand into his eyes, hoping it was just a particularly vivid fever dream. But no. The doors clicked open in eerie unison, and out stepped a man who looked like he'd been surgically extracted from a government brochure. Polished shoes, earpiece, jawline that could file lawsuits. He didn't blink. He didn't smirk. He just said, "Mr. Miller, she would like to see you." Now, there are certain sentences that carry historical weight. I have a dream. Tear down this wall. I did not have sexual relations with that woman. And then there's this. She would like to see you. Not, we'd like to talk or please come with us, which might have suggested a court summons or a wellness check. This was a summons in the old world sense, a royal decree disguised as casual courtesy. Jake didn't move, not out of fear, but because the last 24 hours had functioned like a performance art piece titled Middle Class Collapse. First, fired by a man who thought empathy was a communist plot, then visited by what appeared to be the motorcade of a United Nations envoy. Now invited, no, summoned, by a woman who just yesterday couldn't afford gloves but now had an entourage that looked like it moonlighted as a presidential kill squad. And then she stepped out. Not stumbled, not shuffled. Stepped. The woman he'd helped, the same one with the scraped hands and trembling voice, now wore a cashmere coat that probably had its own zip code. Her brooch sparkled like it was judging everyone in the zip code next door. The lines on her face hadn't vanished, but they no longer looked like marks of exhaustion. They looked like medals. Letitia James didn't need to say anything. Her entrance did the talking. She didn't ask for deference. She brought gravity, the kind of gravity that makes grown men in $800 suits shift uncomfortably. She glanced once at the cracked driveway, once at Jake's flannel robe, and smiled like it was all part of some elaborate audition tape he didn't know he was filming. "Good morning, Mr. Miller," she said. Her voice now had that measured calm you only hear from women who've spent their entire lives being underestimated and then weaponized every second of it. "May I come in for a moment?" Jake didn't answer. He just stepped aside like someone who realizes the chessboard was upside down the entire game. His living room wasn't much. Second-hand couch, bills in a shoebox, a mug he stole from the shop still reading "Number 1 Mechanic." But if she noticed, she didn't comment. Letitia sat with the comfort of a woman who'd once testified before Congress and won. She crossed her legs, clasped her hands, and looked him square in the eye. No condescension, no pity, just quiet calculation. The silence in that room wasn't awkward. It was surgical. Jake was waiting for the punchline, for her to tell him this was a social experiment for TikTok, for her to ask if he'd ever considered switching cable providers. But she just sat there, cool as January asphalt. And in that moment, it became painfully clear. This wasn't a woman who took rides. She gave them. This wasn't about a bike. It never was. This was about something much bigger. And Jake Miller, fired, broke, robe-wearing Jake, wasn't just in the story now. He was the damn plot. And as the steam curled out of his chipped coffee mug and her security detail waited without blinking outside, Jake realized one more thing. Anyone who ever said kindness was free had never seen it pull up in 7 bulletproof SUVs. Jake's hands trembled slightly as he handed her a chipped mug, the kind that proudly read Dao 1 Mechanic, despite being earned more through duct tape than merit badges. She didn't take it. "No tea, thank you," she said, not unkindly, but with the calm precision of someone who'd once had to testify before a room full of senators pretending not to know her name. Instead, she reached into a leather satchel that clearly hadn't been purchased with food stamps and laid a thick file on the coffee table. The sound it made, thunk, was the sound of something institutional, irreversible, and very, very expensive. "I never told you who I was," she said quietly, almost as if she were delivering the setup to a joke. But the punchline didn't come with a laugh. It came with a name. "My name is Letitia James." Jake blinked, then blinked again, because one blink wasn't enough to process the fact that the woman he'd seen scraping ice off a broken bicycle chain was now revealing herself to be the sitting Attorney General of New York. Not an influencer, not a social worker, not a rich widow who got bored with her dogs. No, she was the person who'd once stared down multi-billion-dollar corporations in court, subpoenaed entire agencies, and still made time to file civil rights lawsuits between press conferences. "You might have heard the name," she added, without vanity. "Or maybe just the lawsuits." Jake was trying to remember if he had paid his parking tickets. Letitia continued, her tone now brisk, professional. A woman who had no time for pretense but infinite time for principle. "Yesterday was a test. One I designed. For the past few months I've visited towns like this, businesses like yours, dressed plainly. No title, no security detail, no press releases. I wanted to see how people treated someone they thought had nothing to offer. I wasn't looking for saints. I was looking for honesty under pressure. You, Mr. Miller, passed." Jake didn't say anything. Because what do you say when the second most powerful woman in the state tells you that you, a mechanic with overdue utility bills, have passed a test nobody knew was happening? "You helped me," she went on. "Not because you thought you'd get something, not because a camera was rolling, not because someone would tweet about it. You did it because it was the right thing to do. And for that, I'm not here to thank you. I'm here to change your life." She opened the file like a lawyer preparing to end the trial early. Official seals, government headers, legal weight in every line. "I'm offering you a position, head of mechanical operations, at a new publicly funded research initiative my office is backing. 6-figure salary, full benefits, relocation package, if needed, and a personal lab space outfitted to your specifications." Jake finally found his voice, though it cracked like an old engine. "Ma'am, I don't even have a degree. I never finished school. I just know how to fix things." "That's exactly what makes you dangerous," Letitia said, her voice razor sharp. "Degrees are proof you can memorize. You've already proven you can innovate. In this state, we have enough resumes. What we lack is character." She stood, the file still on the table, untouched. "You have 24 hours to decide," she said, walking toward the door. Then she paused. "Not for drama, for certainty. But something tells me you already have." And with that, she stepped out of his living room and back into the convoy of shadows that had parked like a warning shot in his driveway. The SUVs stood there, not revving, not idling, but waiting. waiting like every bureaucrat who'd ever said, "We'll be in touch," but actually meant it. Jake was left staring at a stack of documents that promised to reroute his entire existence. One minute he was scraping grease off a carburetor to buy meds for his mom. The next, he was being offered a personal lab funded by the same state that couldn't pave his street properly. Irony? Sure. Justice? Maybe. But one thing was suddenly, blisteringly clear. In a system that rarely notices the Jakes of the world unless they forget to pay taxes or park crooked, somehow, someway, he'd been seen. And the people who fired him for helping a stranger, they were about to learn something brutal. Decency might not pay by the hour, but it does pay attention. Now all that remained was the decision. But was it really a choice at all? Jake's phone didn't just buzz, it practically performed CPR on his coffee table. Dozens of messages poured in from neighbors who had, until yesterday, confused him for the guy who mowed lawns on weekends. Now they were sending blurry photos of black SUVs like they'd witnessed a mob funeral or the second coming of Elvis. One message read, "Is the FBI taking you in or promoting you?" Another added, "If you're running drugs, blink twice." Jake peeked through the curtain. For the first time in years, his life didn't feel like a slow crawl toward nowhere. It felt weightless. Not because anything had changed externally. He still lived in the same worn-out house, wore the same thrift store hoodie, but because someone had looked him in the eye and said, "You matter." Not for a vote, not for a post, but for a legacy. But let's not romanticize it too fast, because while his neighbors were snapping photos like TMZ interns, Jake was trying to make sense of a scenario so surreal it could have been rejected by a Netflix writer's room for being too optimistic. Letitia James had dropped a government-grade opportunity on his kitchen table like it was a pizza menu, 6-figure salary, custom workshop, full relocation package. In most towns, that would be called winning the lottery. In Brookhaven? That was called suspicious. Jake didn't sleep. Not just because of the offer, but because of who made it. Letitia James didn't strike him as someone prone to impulsive charity. This wasn't Oprah giving away cars. This was the Attorney General of New York betting real taxpayer dollars on a man who hadn't even finished community college. She wasn't interested in transcripts. She was interested in moral torque. The next morning, just as the sun started peeling back the shadows off his porch, Jake returned to the garage, not to beg, but to bury. He walked in quietly, picked up his wrench, and stared at the bench where he'd spent the last decade fixing other people's problems while no one noticed his own. No one stopped him. Not even Mitch, the man-child in charge, who once yelled at a teenage intern for sneezing too loudly near a tire display. Jake whispered, "Thank you." Not to the place, but to the man he used to be, silent, consistent, invisible. Then he zipped up the red bag with the tools that had always listened when no one else did, and walked out. He didn't leave a note. He left a legacy. One that Mitch wouldn't notice until a month from now when customer complaints started rolling in because no one knew how to reset the diagnostic on a '98 Tacoma. And that, friends, is poetic justice with a socket wrench. Back home, a different car waited. Not one of those black tanks from yesterday. This was sleeker, more deliberate. One door opened, and out stepped a woman in a power suit sharp enough to slice through red tape. Sunglasses that screamed, "I audit people before breakfast." "Mr. Miller?" she said with a practiced smile. "Jessica Lane. I'm Ms. James's personal assistant. I'm here to facilitate your onboarding process." Jake blinked. I've never worked in a whatever this is." She didn't miss a beat. "That's exactly why Ms. James wants you. She's not hiring resumes. She's hiring values." Then she handed him a second envelope, thicker, unopened. "This is your sign-on bonus. She asks that you only open it if you accept." Jake stared at it like it might detonate. Jessica, cool as ever, continued, "If you're ready, I'll take you to the facility." "So you can see what your future might look like." He hesitated. Not because he doubted the offer, but because, for the first time in his life, someone had handed him a door and expected him to walk through it. He nodded. "Yeah, let's go." The ride was quiet, but not uncomfortable. Every block they passed stripped another layer of self-doubt from his skin. They crossed out of the industrial zone, past the closed diners and discount vape shops, until the city fell away, and the skyline changed. Then he saw it. The facility rose like something out of a sci-fi film, if that film had a production budget approved by the state legislature and a zero-tolerance policy for inefficiency. Glass walls, solar panels, engineers who walked like they knew their job could change lives, not just quarterly numbers. There wasn't a single cubicle in sight. Just ambition. Tidy, humming, state-funded ambition. Jake stared, wide-eyed. This wasn't just a job. This was the other America, the one nobody told him existed. Letitia James wasn't the type to linger in a doorway, but when Jake stepped into the facility, she was already there, standing under institutional lighting that somehow didn't dare cast a shadow on her. "Welcome, Jake," she said, not like a bureaucrat reading off a welcome memo, but like someone who'd known the end of this sentence before the first word was spoken. "You made the right choice." Of course he had. The real question wasn't why. It was, what kind of country still required a mechanic to gamble everything just to be noticed by it? She led him through a space that felt less like a building and more like the punchline to a joke about government waste finally doing something right. Labs with ambient lighting and zero clutter. Design bays that could have hosted a TED Talk on the future of dignity. Robotic arms moved with the kind of precision Jake used to pray for when aligning a busted transmission by flashlight. Then came the testing garage. Machines Jake had only seen on PBS after midnight, tucked between documentaries on endangered frogs and oil spills. And then, with a swipe and a click, she opened a private door. "This is your workshop," Letitia said. No fanfare, just 5 words that hit like a crowbar to the ribcage of self-doubt. Jake stepped in, and for a second forgot to breathe. It wasn't just clean, it was sacred. Polished floors, brand new snap-on tools arranged like they'd been waiting specifically for his calloused hands. Touchscreen diagnostic systems humming quietly, respectful of their purpose. A whole wall of components labeled in fonts so perfect even Helvetica would feel insecure. And space, actual space, to build, tinker, fail, learn, and try again. It wasn't a workshop. It was permission. Letitia stood beside him without interrupting his silence. She didn't need to pitch. The room had already closed the deal, but she spoke anyway. Softly, but with a clarity that would make a Supreme Court ruling sound vague. "Talent deserves the right environment," she said. "You fixed what you thought was an old woman's broken bike, but you treated it like it was a Bentley engine powered by dignity. That told me everything I needed to know." Jake turned, but before he could say anything, she was already halfway to the door. And that's when it hit him. Not the awe, not the disbelief, but the question that had been chewing at the edge of every moment since this all began. Why me? Not just why him. But why now? Why would one of the most powerful public officials in the country go undercover, travel to some half-defunded garage in Brookhaven, and risk a herniated disc on a $10 bicycle? Letitia paused at the door as if she'd read the question straight from his spine. "Tomorrow," she said, "you'll understand everything. You weren't chosen by chance." The next morning, Jake arrived before the sun had the nerve to shine on the facility's glass exterior. He stood there, boots hitting the polished lobby like punctuation marks in a sentence he didn't yet know how to finish. The doors opened on cue. No security badges, no buzzers. Just silent affirmation that he belonged where, a week ago, he would have been mistaken for the janitor. Jessica Lane greeted him at the front desk, not with fake cheer, but that same pragmatic kindness that said, "You're here because you earned it, not because someone felt sorry for you." "Good morning, Mr. Miller," she said. "Ms. James is expecting you upstairs." They walked past framed awards, front-page clippings, citations of innovation, and patents signed by people who probably had their own Wikipedia pages. But then Jake stopped. One photo, sun-faded and crooked, caught his eye. It wasn't the accolades or the trophy cases. It was the quiet one, the only one in black and white. There she was. A younger Letitia, fewer lines on her face, same steel in the eyes, standing beside a man Jake recognized not from the news, but from his bathroom mirror. Rough hands, sharp posture, a stare that once told him, "You don't need to be loud to be strong." Jessica paused behind him, her voice gentle now. "You recognize him, don't you?" Jake nodded slowly. "That's my grandfather, Thomas Miller." She smiled. "That photo was taken 42 years ago. He mentored Miss James when she was just a teenager." Jake felt his knees buckle, but he didn't fall, because somewhere deep down, something started rearranging itself. A narrative he didn't even know he was part of began clicking into place, bolt by bolt, like the engines he used to rebuild without instruction manuals. His grandfather, the quiet man with grease under his nails and a spine made of decency, had helped shape the most formidable legal mind in the state, and never bragged once. Jake had spent his life thinking legacy came from big money or big names. Apparently, it came from small acts that ripple across decades and resurface in rooms you never thought you'd enter. And that photo? That wasn't a snapshot. It was a blueprint. The next door would reveal just how far back this story really went. Jessica didn't slow her pace, nor did she need to. Her words were delivered with the poise of someone who had long ago realized that most of the people running this country wouldn't recognize integrity unless it threatened to sue them. "You weren't chosen randomly, Mr. Miller," she said with quiet certainty. "Your skill may have brought you to her attention, but your name sealed it." And with that, she let the silence speak for a few steps before the next door opened and Jake entered the office of Letitia James. She stood before a towering window, arms crossed in a way that didn't close her off, but rather framed her, like a portrait of power that knew exactly where it came from. The morning light hit the glass just enough to cast her in a soft silhouette, but Jake could still see the unmistakable fire in her eyes, not the rage of politicians on cable news. This was something older, earned. She turned and smiled. It wasn't performative. It wasn't part of a pitch. It was the smile of a woman who had been waiting decades to repay a debt that couldn't be measured in money. "Your grandfather saved my life, Jake. Not with influence, not with status, but with kindness, when I had absolutely nothing." Jake said nothing. Because what do you say when the Attorney General of New York tells you she was once a lost teenager sobbing in a junkyard? I was 16, orphaned, alone, no money, no shelter, no sense of where I was headed. I ended up behind that old mechanic lot on 147th and Lenox. Your grandfather found me sitting on a busted oil drum, crying like the world had just ended. And to me, it had. She took a breath, not for effect, but to steady memory. He gave me food, not leftovers. Food. He gave me a place to sleep. But more than that, he gave me belief. He looked at these, she held up her hands, and told me I had something rare, that I could build, that I wasn't broken, just unshaped. Jake's throat tightened. The man who had raised him had barely spoken of his past. A few lessons muttered over carburetors. A few values hammered home with every bolt turned. But not this. Never this. Letitia walked to a nearby cabinet and opened it, not reverently, but with purpose. She pulled out a small, battered red toolbox, the kind every working man keeps, not for utility, but for memory. He gave me this. I kept it. Every year, every move, every office. I swore that if I ever found someone who carried his hands, his heart, and his damn stubborn eyes, I'd return what he gave me. She placed it in front of Jake like it was an inheritance signed by grit itself. Jake opened the box. Inside, the tools of his childhood blinked back at him like relics from another world. A flathead with a chewed-up grip. A flashlight with TM scratched into the handle. The same wrench he used to hold as a boy, pretending he was helping. Letitia's voice softened. I was never able to thank him, but through you I can. Jake looked up, and for the first time since this began, he felt something deeper than shock. He felt seen. You already have, he whispered. She nodded, then gestured toward the hallway. Come with me. There's something else you need to see. They descended a narrow elevator to a lower level. The lights dimmed. The air cooled. Bureaucracy and public tours didn't reach this far down. Security scanners flicked green as they passed, and finally they stopped in front of a thick steel door. She entered a code. The door hissed open. Inside, silence, except for the low hum of possibility. A massive vehicle sat under the glow of pale blue light. Its surface was matte, seamless, like a whisper forged into metal. Sleek, aerodynamic, unlike anything Jake had ever seen. A car? A ship? A promise? Letitia didn't dramatize it. She didn't name drop. She just said, "This is Project Horizon." Jake approached slowly, hands trembling, like a priest nearing a sacred relic. "What is this?" She answered as if she'd been waiting years for the question. Your grandfather helped sketch the first concept. It was his dream, one he drew by hand while the rest of the world mocked the idea. A machine that could run forever. Clean energy, zero emissions, self-healing materials. It was too early then. The tech didn't exist. The funding was political poison, so we shelved it. But now, the future has finally caught up to the man who imagined it. Jake turned to her, breath short. You want me to build this? Letitia shook her head, not in denial, but in declaration. Number, I want you to lead it. She didn't mean manage a team. She didn't mean sit in meetings. She meant own it, carry it, drive it forward like the country should have been doing for decades if it hadn't been too busy subsidizing oil companies and pretending green innovation was a Marxist fever dream. Jake stood there, jaw clenched, heart pounding, and something inside him snapped into place. Not with fear, but with purpose. This wasn't just about redemption or opportunity. This was about finishing what his grandfather started and exposing, by doing so, just how small the thinking had been among those who had the power but not the courage. Project Horizon wasn't just an invention. It was a reckoning, and Jake had just become its architect. He wasn't just a mechanic anymore. That label, once tossed around by self-important managers as a backhanded compliment, "He's great with his hands, just not corporate material," had been burned off by truth and torque. Jake Miller had crossed the threshold from being someone who fixed machines to someone who forged futures. And unlike the CEOs of collapsing tech startups who still couldn't explain what their app did, Jake didn't need a TED Talk. His story was written in wrenches, sweat, and the quiet dignity of knowing which end of a socket set to use. Every tool in the lab spoke to him like a hymn. They weren't just instruments. They were echoes. The kind of echoes you only hear in places that honor work, not worship title. Each bolt tightened reminded him of the man who raised him with lessons measured in patience, not performance reviews. Each circuit calibrated with care felt like a whispered nod from a grandfather who never needed a podium to change a life. Letitia James didn't hover, didn't micromanage, and certainly didn't give motivational talks, filled with vacuous buzzwords like synergy or value alignment. No, she stood beside him with the solemn assurance of a general backing her field commander. She watched him not with skepticism, but with certainty, the kind of certainty that rattles institutions used to confusing Ivy League degrees with integrity. "You won't be alone," she said one evening, her voice cutting through the hum of machinery like a benediction. "I'll stand beside you. Together, we bring Project Horizon to life." It wasn't sentimentality. It was declaration. Jake's hands trembled slightly as he reached for the first tool, not because he feared failure, but because for the first time in his life, he knew the weight of doing something that actually mattered. This wasn't a career move. It was a resurrection of every ignored blueprint scribbled on bar napkins, of every working-class genius told, "You're smart, but not the right kind of smart." A vindication for every laborer whose ideas died in break rooms while managers gave PowerPoints on innovation culture. Jake didn't build with ego. He built with memory. His grandfather's memory, his own memories, the memory of an old woman whose disguised kindness proved sharper than any courtroom cross-examination. And it showed. Days melted into nights. Jake worked not like a man under pressure, but like a man unshackled. He navigated obstacles not by brute force, but by recalling the one lesson the system never taught, but his grandfather always preached. The most powerful tool in your hands is belief, especially when no one else shares it. When the energy core wouldn't stabilize, he recalibrated it by applying principles he learned fixing busted radiators in 20-degree winters. When the structural alloy bent under stress, he solved it, not with a PhD, but with patience and a wrench. Every glitch was a ghost, every fix an exorcism. And then the whispers started. First from engineers, then from journalists, then from the same government officials who once treated innovation as a punchline, unless it could be trademarked and monetized before the next election cycle. They called it a miracle, a marvel, a movement. But Jake didn't care about headlines. He cared about torque ratios and alignment symmetry. The same neighbors who once thought he was being recruited by the FBI were now passing around screenshots of the prototype like proud relatives at a 4th of July picnic. Even the old gas station clerk, who once told Jake he should stick to timing belts, not dreams, started referring to him as the guy rebuilding the future. But none of it surprised Letitia, because this was her bet. Not on fantasy, not on press optics, but on a truth no administration memo could package. When you give real power to people with real values, systems bend, and sometimes they finally break the right way. Jake's transformation wasn't cosmetic, it wasn't a PR stunt, it was structural, and it was contagious. Because when you put integrity behind a welding torch and let it burn, the only thing left standing is what should have been built in the first place, and Project Horizon was only the beginning. Then came the moment that makes or breaks every so-called visionary in this country. The test. Not the kind padded with safety nets and pre-approved media talking points, but the kind where you light the fuse and hope to God your idea doesn't explode, literally or figuratively. The entire lab gathered around the prototype like it was the birth of democracy. Engineers, tech advisors, state reps, 2 skeptical mechanics from Albany who had clearly bet against the project on DraftKings, all standing in silence. Jake approached the console. No bow tie, no rehearsed speech. Just a man in a grease-stained shirt holding a legacy wired into carbon fiber. He flipped the ignition, and the vehicle didn't whimper. It hummed, not like a Prius begging for relevance, but like a promise kept. It moved, steady, deliberate, alive, and in that instant, every sneer he'd ever endured, every lecture from Ron Dorsey about staying in his lane, every bureaucratic shrug from people too comfortable to imagine better, all of it evaporated under the glow of real progress. Tears gathered in Jake's eyes, and not the performative kind politicians fake when polling in Midwestern diners. These were the tears of someone who had clawed his way through disbelief, not his own, but everyone else's. This, Jake thought, is what justice sounds like when it's powered by lithium and not lobbyists. Letitia James, standing quietly at the edge, didn't clap. She nodded, proud, measured, and sharp as ever. "You've honored your grandfather's legacy," she said, her voice low, "and made it your own. The world will never be the same." Coming from anyone else, that might have sounded theatrical, but coming from her, it felt like precedent. Jake turned to the wide lab windows, eyes locked on the horizon. There was no parade, no confetti, just a mechanic, once fired for kindness, now standing on the threshold of a national movement. Proof that one good deed can detonate an entire system of bad assumptions. And as it turns out, systems fear men like Jake, because he didn't rise through nepotism or backroom deals. He rose because he didn't play by the rules, and still outbuilt those who did. News broke fast, the kind of fast usually reserved for celebrity arrests and White House scandals. Mechanic leads Green Revolution. Brookhaven's blueprint for American redemption. One headline from a center-left outlet even read, "The future arrived in a wrench." Jake's phone became a war zone. Messages from tech investors, federal energy reps, Ivy League engineers pretending to be working class adjacent. Everyone wanted a piece. Everyone except Ron Dorsey, who was last seen giving a bitter Yelp review to his own garage for lack of vision. But Jake? Jake stayed grounded, not because he was humble, but because he remembered. He remembered the cold mornings in that creaky garage. He remembered how no one looked twice until 7 SUVs blocked traffic in front of his house. He remembered that greatness doesn't start in labs or conferences. It starts in how you treat someone who can't pay you back. Weeks later, just before a keynote at the National Tech Summit, Letitia met him backstage. "This is your moment," she said. Not like a cheerleader, but like someone reminding you that moments like this are obligations, not rewards. "You've inspired more people than you realize." Jake nodded. Deep breath. Walked onto the stage. Spotlights glared. Applause thundered. But Jake didn't flinch. He didn't pitch a product. He told a story about a woman on a busted bike, about getting fired for doing the right thing, and about a second chance that came wrapped in silence, not spectacle. And the crowd, tech giants, journalists, even the climate czar who once called grassroots innovation naive, rose to their feet. Afterward, a tall man in a precisely tailored suit approached him. The kind of man who could buy a congressional seat and still have change left for a yacht. "Marcus Reynolds," he said smoothly. "CEO, Zenith Energy. We want to help scale Project Horizon nationwide." Jake didn't blink. "Then start with cities no one funds. If you want to help, help where it's hardest." Marcus paused, recalibrating, then nodded. That night, as the sun dipped below the lab's skyline, Jake stood outside with a mug of bitter coffee and a full heart. The sky was painted with quiet fire, orange, violet, and gold, and Jake understood. Those SUVs weren't luxury. They were consequence, the result of doing what's right when no one's watching. The road ahead would be rough, that much was certain. But now Jake Miller was no longer walking it alone. And America? It had just remembered what progress looks like when built by hand. He was no longer the guy who fixed bikes in silence while his boss barked about margins like a pit bull on payroll. Jake Miller had done the unthinkable in a country addicted to cynicism. He'd weaponized decency, not as branding, not as strategy, as truth. He had taken the most ridiculed currency in American life, kindness, and turned it into capital more powerful than venture funding or Senate endorsements. While career politicians polished their talking points and legacy media asked if empathy could scale, Jake had already built something that answered both. He hadn't just hacked the impossible. He'd rewritten the source code, and not with slick PowerPoints or buzzword-laced white papers, but with calloused hands and moral torque. His story wasn't a bootstraps fairy tale. It was a wrench to the face of every system that said people like him were only good for clocking in, not dreaming out loud. The road ahead would be brutal. It always is when you challenge the status quo with something more radical than protest. Proof. But Jake was ready. Because greatness, the kind that outlasts applause, isn't born in labs or legislatures. It rises from the quiet courage to get up again and again and to pull someone else up with you. And Jake Miller? He wasn't just walking that road, he was paving it. "This is your moment," she said. Not like a cheerleader, but like someone reminding you that moments like this are obligations, not rewards. "You've inspired more people than you realize." Jake nodded. Deep breath. Walked onto the stage. Spotlights glared. Applause thundered. But Jake didn't flinch. He didn't pitch a product. He told a story about a woman on a busted bike, about getting fired for doing the right thing, and about a second chance that came wrapped in silence, not spectacle. And the crowd, tech giants, journalists, even the climate czar who once called grassroots innovation naive, rose to their feet. Afterward, a tall man in a precisely tailored suit approached him. The kind of man who could buy a congressional seat and still have change left for a yacht. "Marcus Reynolds," he said smoothly. "CEO, Zenith Energy. We want to help scale Project Horizon nationwide." Jake didn't blink. "Then start with cities no one funds. If you want to help, help where it's hardest." Marcus paused, recalibrating, then nodded. That night, as the sun dipped below the lab's skyline, Jake stood outside with a mug of bitter coffee and a full heart. The sky was painted with quiet fire, orange, violet, and gold, and Jake understood. Those SUVs weren't luxury. They were consequence, the result of doing what's right when no one's watching. The road ahead would be rough. That much was certain. But now Jake Miller was no longer walking it alone. And America? It had just remembered what progress looks like when built by hand. He was no longer the guy who fixed bikes in silence while his boss barked about margins like a pit bull on payroll. Jake Miller had done the unthinkable in a country addicted to cynicism. He'd weaponized decency, not as branding, not as strategy, as truth. He had taken the most ridiculed currency in American life, kindness, and turned it into capital more powerful than venture funding or Senate endorsements. While career politicians polished their talking points and legacy media asked if empathy could scale, Jake had already built something that answered both. He hadn't just hacked the impossible, he'd rewritten the source code, and not with slick PowerPoints or buzzword-laced white papers, but with calloused hands and moral torque. His story wasn't a bootstraps fairy tale. It was a wrench to the face of every system that said people like him were only good for clocking in, not dreaming out loud. The road ahead would be brutal. It always is when you challenge the status quo with something more radical than protest. Proof. But Jake was ready. Because greatness, the kind that outlasts applause, isn't born in labs or legislatures. It rises from the quiet courage to get up again and again and to pull someone else up with you. And Jake Miller? He wasn't just walking that road, he was paving it.